Throughout the course of human history, tens of thousands of wars, both large and small, have erupted across the globe, driven by a multitude of causes that led to bloodshed. Some wars broke out due to disputes over economic interests, while others stemmed from territorial ambitions. However, today let's join Did You Know? On a journey back in time to explore one of the first continent-wide religious wars in history, the First Crusade, which unfolded in a unique historical context between Europe and the Middle East at the end of the 11th century. According to historical research, most of the Crusades were deeply rooted in religious motivations, specifically the Western Christian desire to reclaim control of the Holy Land of Jerusalem from Muslim rule. However, beyond the religious factor, there were also profound political, economic, and social causes on both the European and Middle Eastern sides that contributed to the emergence of these wars. Before the 7th century, Christianity had already flourished and held dominance in many regions such as Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. However, when Islam emerged in the early 7th century on the Arabian Peninsula, the religious and geopolitical landscape changed dramatically. After the death of the Prophet Muhammad, Islamic caliphs continued expanding their influence through large-scale military conquests. Between around 661 and 750 during the Umayyad Caliphate, Muslim armies rapidly conquered most of North Africa, advanced into Spain in 711, and even threatened France by reaching the Battle of Poitiers in 732. In the east, they seized key territories of the Byzantine Empire, including Syria, Palestine, and Egypt regions that had once been strongholds of ancient Christianity. By the 11th century, tensions escalated further when the Seljuk Turks, a rising Muslim power, defeated the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert, 1071, and took control of Jerusalem, sparking deep concern within the Christian world. This marked a critical turning point in leading to Pope Urban II's call for the Crusade in 1095, which ignited a series of intense religious wars between Western Catholicism and the Islamic Middle East that would last for centuries. At that time, pilgrimages by Christian believers from across Europe to the Holy Land, especially Palestine, home to Jerusalem, had become increasingly common, particularly from the 9th to the 11th centuries. Although the Muslim authorities did not outright ban pilgrimages, they imposed heavy taxes, strict controls, and limitations, which provoked widespread anger and resentment within the Western Christian community. Many believers felt that the sacred sites had been defiled or even blasphemed by being under the control of infidels. At the same time, the political situation of the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantine, was falling into severe decline. Once a major power in the East, by the 11th century, the empire had been reduced to just a few remaining territories in Europe and Anatolia. The threat of Muslim expansion, particularly by the Seljuk Turks into the west, became increasingly imminent. The crisis reached its peak at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, where the Byzantine army suffered a catastrophic defeat and Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes was captured alive. This loss effectively shattered the Byzantine defensive lines in Anatolia and opened the path for waves of Turkish settlers to push further inland. Seizing the opportunity, Suleiman ibn Kutulmish, a Seljuk leader, occupied Nicaea, just a few dozen kilometers from the capital Constantinople, and began settling his warriors at the very doorstep of the empire's heart. The situation had become extremely dire. Facing the prospect of annihilation, Emperor Alexios Komnenos of Byzantium decided to take an unprecedented step. He sent envoys across the sea to the Vatican, seeking military support from the West, from people who had once been rivals, but were now by necessity reluctant allies in the face of a common enemy. On November 27, 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II seized the moment to deliver a proclamation that would shake all of Europe. He denounced the alleged brutalities of the Muslims, especially their occupation of Jerusalem, the Holy Land of God. Urban II not only called for aid to the Eastern Christians, but also inspired belief that anyone who joined the campaign to liberate the Holy Land would be forgiven of all sins and guaranteed a place in heaven. This call sparked an unprecedented crusading movement as tens of thousands of knights, nobles, peasants, and devout followers from across Europe began preparing for the journey. Some were motivated by faith, others by glory, land wealth, or the hope of a new life. However, even before the Pope's official army departed, the first violent outbreaks occurred this time against the Jewish communities of Europe. In May 1096, in the city of Speyer, Germany, spontaneous crusader groups led by Peter the Hermit and other fanatical preachers killed hundreds of Jews whom they labeled Christ killers. The madness spread to Worms, Mainz, and Cologne, where thousands of Jews were slaughtered in a wave of massacres, later known as the Crusade pogroms, a lasting stain on the history of this religious movement. By the end of 1096, the official crusader armies led by prominent lords such as Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and Count Stephen of Blois began marching into Byzantine territory along prearranged routes. Their ultimate goal to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control and to write one of the bloodiest, most dramatic, and most controversial chapters in human history, the First Crusade. In late spring of 1096, even before the official crusader armies had set out, numerous unofficial expeditions composed of peasants, religious fanatics, and local militias began marching toward the Holy Land. These groups were led by figures such as Emich of Leiningen, Count William of Nevers, and several other regional leaders. But instead of fighting Muslims, they unleashed their fury on Jewish communities along the Rhine River, particularly in cities like Worms, Mainz, and Cologne. A series of bloody massacres followed. Jews who refused to convert were murdered, while women and children were subjected to forced conversions or killed outright. The savagery drove Jewish religious leaders like Kalonymus ben Meshulam to commit mass suicide along with their families to avoid falling into the hands of their tormentors, one of the most heart-wrenching religious tragedies in medieval Europe. By summer of 1096, the official crusader armies, divided into four main contingents, began their journey. These forces were led by Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman noble from southern Italy, Raymond IV of Toulouse, the most powerful lord of southern France, and Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the King of France. These were the four principal crusader armies officially blessed and endorsed by Pope Urban II. One by one, they made their way to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, assembling outside the city between late 1096 and early 1097. After crossing the Bosphorus Strait, the crusader forces entered Anatolia and joined up with a detachment of the Byzantine army. They also received logistical support from Emperor Alexios III Komnenos, who, though wary of the Crusaders, had no choice but to cooperate in order to push back the Turkish threat. The first strategic target of the campaign was Nicaea, a fortified city on the shores of Lake Ascania, which had previously served as the capital of the Seljuk Turks in the region. At the time, Nicaea was under the control of Khalid Arslan, the Turkish Sultan. However, Arslan had underestimated the strength of the Crusaders and had taken most of his army eastward to fight other rivals. On May 14, 1097, the Crusaders began the siege of Nicaea. When news reached Khalid Arslan, he rushed back to confront the invaders and launched a counterattack on May 16th. However, he suffered a crushing defeat and was forced to retreat in disarray. Worse still for the Seljuks, another of Arslan's advanced forces was annihilated on May 20th and 21st by the combined forces of Raymond of Toulouse and Robert of Flanders. After a string of successive defeats, the Seljuk army withdrew entirely from the Nicaea region, and on May 26th, the city fell into Crusader hands. This was the first major victory for the Crusaders over a fortified Muslim stronghold, and it boosted Christian morale to unprecedented levels. However, the war was far from over. On June 29th, Khalid Arslan, unwilling to concede defeat, formed an alliance with Danish Mengazi, another powerful Turkish leader, and together they plotted a deadly ambush near Dorylaeum. Learning of this plan, the Crusader commanders decided to split their forces into two columns. One, led by Bohemond and Robert of Normandy, would move ahead to serve as bait, while the second, led by Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse, would follow behind as reinforcement. On the night of June 30th, the Crusaders began a perilous three-day march through rugged terrain, pushing deeper into hostile territory toward what would become a decisive, blood-soaked battle at Dorylaeum, a clash that would seal the fate of thousands. On July 1st, 1097, Bohemond's vanguard moved through the northern plains of the Fablet River, near the ruins of the town of Duran, when they suddenly walked into a well-coordinated ambush set by Turkish forces under Khalid Arslan's command at Dorylaeum. The forward units, composed mostly of troops from Bohemond Robert of Normandy and Stephen of Blois, found themselves surrounded on all sides. At dawn, Kilij Arslan and his ally Danishmend launched a ferocious assault, unleashing waves of elite mounted archers, attacking relentlessly from all directions. Bohemond was forced to form an emergency defensive circle using wagons to repel cavalry charges, and bought precious time by sending urgent messengers to the rear column for reinforcements. Fortunately, by midday, the reinforcements led by Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse arrived just in time. The battle escalated into an all-out clash as the Second Crusader force entered the battlefield from behind the Turkish line, catching the enemy off guard. The Battle of Dorylaeum raged until late evening. At a critical moment, Ashima, a little-known but courageous Crusader commander, led a flanking detachment around a mountain ridge and launched a surprise assault on the Turkish rear camp, plunging the enemy into chaos and panic. Caught between two fronts, the Turkish army broke ranks and fled in terror. It was yet another resounding victory for the Crusaders. The spoils of war were considerable gold weapons, war horses, everything the Crusader army needed to grow stronger with every battle. And with each step closer to Jerusalem, their determination and might only grew stronger. In October 1097, after weeks of marching through treacherous mountain terrain, the United Crusader army finally reached the banks of the Orontes River, standing face to face with Antioch, one of the most formidable Muslim strongholds in Syria. The city of Antioch was a fortress of monumental strength, surrounded by 3 concentric walls and watchtowers stretching across the rugged hillsides. But even before the siege began, divisions emerged within the Crusader leadership. Bohemond advocated for a direct assault to claim glory, while Godfrey and Raymond preferred a long-term siege to minimize losses. By mid-October, a small relief force led by Reinald Bohemond's nephew arrived from San Siro, bringing food and supplies, just enough to sustain the siege. But then winter crept in. Supplies ran dangerously low, while those inside Antioch remained well-fed and fortified. Outside the walls, the Crusaders began to suffer from hunger, cold, and disease. In December, a sudden earthquake struck, killing hundreds and shattering morale. Roughly 1/7 of the army had died or deserted. Then in early 1098, a miracle arrived from the west. A small fleet led by Passalis, the deposed king of England, crossed the Mediterranean and landed near Port Simmons, a Byzantine-controlled area on the eastern coast. The fleet carried much-needed food and medicine to support the Antioch campaign. But good news was quickly overshadowed by dread Kerboga. The powerful warlord of Mosul was marching with a massive relief army to lift the siege of Antioch. If the Crusaders did not take the city before Kerboga arrived, they would be trapped and annihilated. Realizing time was slipping away, Bohemond devised his boldest plan yet to bribe an Armenian gatekeeper inside the city to let the Crusaders in under cover of night. If the Crusaders wanted to survive, they needed a miracle or a plan so reckless it bordered on madness. Bohemond, ever the schemer, secretly made contact with Firuz, an Armenian guard stationed at the Tower of the Two Sisters. Firuz, disillusioned with his Muslim overlords, was eventually persuaded by promises of gold and power. He agreed to open a forgotten side gate in the dead of night. That night, Bohemond led a small group of soldiers, carefully following Firuz's directions, scaling a cliff under the cover of darkness and slipping into Antioch through the hidden passage. Once inside, they rushed to open the main gates, allowing the entire Crusader force to flood into the city. By dawn on June 3, 1098, Antioch, the strongest fortress in the Levant, had fallen to the Crusaders. The remaining Muslim defenders fled in panic. Governor Yagi Sian attempted to escape, but was captured and later executed. But even as the Crusaders prepared to celebrate, a far greater danger loomed on the horizon. On June 5th, the mighty army of Kerboga, the warlord of Mosul, arrived before the gates of Antioch. With him was Smashdallah, son of Charlie. Season 3 Ga, a powerful Turkish noble commanding the reinforcements from Aleppo. On June 7th and 9th, Kerboga launched fierce assaults on the eastern gates, but each attack was repelled. Inside the city, the Crusaders were exhausted, having endured weeks of starvation and relentless combat. Then came a turning point. On June 28th, the Crusaders unexpectedly sallied forth, organizing into 3 divisions, launching a direct assault on Kerboga's forces. But then something strange happened. Before the two armies could clash, many of Kerboga's allies, local emirs such as Togrul Ridwan and others suddenly withdrew from the field. They had grown suspicious of Kerboga's ambitions and no longer trusted him. With his coalition collapsing, Kerboga's forces disintegrated. He fled the battlefield in disgrace, earning a place in history as one of the most humiliating failures of the Muslim world in that era. Antioch was officially held by the Crusaders. Following the victory, Bohemond declared Antioch as his personal principality, refusing to hand it over to any collective authority despite fierce objections from Raymond of Toulouse and Godfrey of Bouillon. Internal conflict erupted among the Crusaders. Stephen of Blois, one of the wealthiest French nobles, gave up and returned to Europe. In September 1098, Raymond and several other leaders sent letters to Pope Urban II pleading for his intervention to reclaim control of Antioch. But the Pope refused, stating this was a matter of military command and that the victor had the right to rule. By November, in an effort to preserve unity within the Crusader coalition, Raymond reluctantly relinquished his claim, allowing Bohemond to retain Antioch. He withdrew his troops and began preparing for the next phase of the campaign, the march toward Jerusalem. By March 1099, after enduring a brutal winter, the remaining Crusader forces began their advance south toward their ultimate goal, Jerusalem. Along the way, they encountered the city of Acre, a major coastal trading hub. The Crusaders laid siege to Acre for 2 months but failed to capture it due to continuous naval resupply from the sea. On May 13, 1099, Raymond and other leaders attempted to negotiate peace-offering terms if the Muslim defenders of Acre agreed to cease support for Jerusalem and allow the Crusader army safe passage. They would not be attacked. However, this proposal was quickly rejected by other Crusader leaders, especially Tancred, Bohemond's nephew, who did not trust any treaty with Muslims. And so the march to Jerusalem continued, with the Crusaders fully aware that they would soon face the most heavily fortified city in the entire Middle East and that blood would be shed. On June 6, 1099, Grey Rectangular and Captain, 2 commanders of the Western Crusader forces, captured the town of Bethlehem, located just a few miles from Jerusalem. It was a strategic move, establishing a logistical base for the upcoming assault on the Holy City. On June 7, after more than 3 years of marching across Europe and the Middle East, the Crusader army finally laid eyes on Jerusalem, visible from the hills of Judea. The city's golden walls shimmered in the sunlight like a divine promise, etched in the hearts of tens of thousands who had sworn to liberate the Holy Land from the infidels. But what they saw wasn't just a sacred symbol, it was also a fortress nearly impregnable. The Fatimids of Egypt, who controlled Jerusalem at the time, had heavily fortified the city. Towering walls surrounded by arid terrain with scorched earth, no shade and no fresh water in sight made the siege even more daunting. As soon as they arrived, the Crusaders encircled the city from all directions. The Army of Flanders and the Army of Network Onward Robot, Xukio and Noimangdi, took positions in the north, blockading the city from the Damascus Gate to Herod's Tower. Tancred, the Norman commander, occupied the west, directly facing the Tower of David, the most formidable gate of the city. However, the Levantine summer was merciless. Scorching heat, dwindling food supplies, scarce clean water, and most critically, no siege engines made conditions unbearable. To make things worse, the Fatimids had destroyed all nearby wells, forcing the Crusaders to fetch water from the Jordan River over 20 kilometers away. Facing these desperate conditions, the Crusader leaders decided to launch a full-scale assault on June 13th, but it was a disaster. The city's walls were too strong. With no siege towers, no catapults, and not even enough ladders, they were repelled with heavy casualties. The tide turned when a Genoese fleet arrived up from the sea, bringing with them wooden military engineers, enabling the Crusaders to construct 2 massive siege towers. On the morning of July 15, 1099, one of the towers under the command of Carlos was rolled into position near the northeastern gate close to Herod's Gate. After hours of intense combat, a group of Crusaders managed to breach the wall, overpowering the guards and opening the gate, allowing the full army to pour into the city. Jerusalem had fallen. According to many sources, including Crusader chronicler Raymond d'Aguilera, the Crusaders launched a horrific massacre, killing thousands of Muslims and Jews without distinction between men, women, or children. Blood ran through the narrow streets of Jerusalem, an image still debated and condemned by historians to this day. Just as the Crusaders believed they had achieved total victory, a new threat emerged: the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, under the command of Al-Afdal Shahanshah, who had no intention of surrendering the Holy City so easily. On August 10th, Al-Afdal marched 50,000 Fatimid troops from Egypt and set up camp on the plains of Ashkelon, just one day's march from Jerusalem, preparing for a decisive counterattack. At this critical moment, the fractured Crusader forces were forced to unite once again. They reorganized into battle formation. Godfrey de Bouillon commanded the left flank. Raymond of Toulouse took the right. Tancred, along with the fast robot of Normandy, held the center. Eastern European contingents, led by Gaston IV in the Vienne Legion, manned the supply and reinforcement lines. Meanwhile, Al-Afdal employed deception tactics, ordering his vanguard to strike the center, while his elite cavalry maneuvered behind to flank the Crusaders from the rear. On August 12th, the Battle of Ashkelon erupted. The Fatimid army outnumbered the Crusaders but lacked close combat experience. The Crusaders, though fewer, were battle-hardened veterans, having survived hundreds of skirmishes from France to Syria. That afternoon, Tancred's Norman cavalry shattered the Fatimid left, while Raymond led a surprise assault on their rear encampment, forcing Al-Afdal to order a full retreat back to Egypt. Jerusalem was secured. After the victory, Godfrey de Bouillon was elected as protector of the Holy Sepulchre, refusing the title of King of Jerusalem, stating that no man should wear a crown where Christ once wore a crown of thorns. Thus ended the First Crusade, one of the rarely successful military-religious campaigns in medieval history. But it also marked the beginning of over 2 centuries of holy wars, filled with blood, tears, betrayal, and questions that remain unanswered to this day. Was it faith or bloodlust disguised as faith? Although the Egyptian army under General Al-Afdal Shahanshah had been defeated and forced to retreat, the Crusader victory at Ashkelon in August 1099 did not lead to total conquest. The city of Ashkelon remained under Muslim control, governed by the Fatimid Caliphate, a strategic failure as the city was a key southern gateway to defend the newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Crusaders had won militarily, but they lacked the strength to occupy and hold more territory. Following the First Crusade, 4 independent Latin Crusader states were established across the Middle East. The Kingdom of Jerusalem took the political and religious center with its capital in the Holy City. The Principality of Antioch, located in northern Syria, strategically vital but under constant pressure from Muslim powers. The County of Edessa, the northernmost and most vulnerable territory, sparsely populated and exposed. The County of Tripoli, a coastal region with a key seaport essential for supply and communication. However, the existence of these states contradicted the original goal of the Byzantine Empire, which had only sought to reclaim lands lost to Muslim forces, not to see independent Western kingdoms rise on what had once been Eastern Roman territory. Thus, the true nature of the First Crusade reveals itself not merely a holy mission, but a conquest wrapped in the cloak of faith and church defense. Despite their victory, the Crusader states remained highly fragile. The County of Edessa, also known as Elissa, stood out as the weakest, most remote to the north, sparsely populated, and constantly surrounded by Muslim forces from all directions. At that time, Count Jocelyn II ruled Edessa. He was a man of great ambition, but found himself isolated in a dangerous and hostile land. In an effort to save his domain, he made the bold decision to form an alliance with a former enemy, the Muslim kingdom of Aleppo, then under the Artukid dynasty, in hopes of avoiding complete encirclement and destruction piece by piece. This bizarre alliance stirred dissatisfaction among many other Crusader lords, especially Zengi, the powerful Muslim leader rising in Mosul and Aleppo. Zengi was a talented and shrewd commander determined to unify the Muslim world and expel the Crusaders from the Holy Land. Upon learning of Jocelyn II's plans, Zengi divided his forces into 2. One contingent remained behind to defend Mosul, while the other secretly marched to attack Edessa, seizing the opportunity as Jocelyn had already left the city to prepare his campaign alongside his new ally. By late 1144, Zengi suddenly besieged Edessa. Jocelyn, stranded in the west, fled to the fortress of Tel Bashir to call for help. But the reinforcements from the Kingdom of Jerusalem were too few and too late. On December 24, 1144, Edessa fell, marking the first complete loss of a Crusader territory since the end of the First Crusade. The fall of Edessa sent shockwaves across Europe. Regions that had once celebrated the First Crusade were now filled with disillusionment and anxiety. Was it all just a temporary victory? Under religious and political pressure, Pope Eugenius III issued a new call for arms, the Second Crusade, this time led by 2 of the most powerful monarchs of Christendom, Louis VII of France and Conrad III, Holy Roman Emperor. From this point onward, Zengi, the powerful emir of Mosul and Aleppo, ordered a full siege on the city of Edessa, one of the Crusader territories in the northern region, considered the earliest conquest of the First Crusade. Zengi, who had prepared in advance, constructed a series of siege towers to break through the city's defensive walls. The inhabitants of Edessa, in a desperate attempt, resisted under the leadership of archbishops and local forces. However, Edessa's defenses were not as strongly fortified as those of larger Crusader cities like Antioch or Jerusalem. Eventually, Zengi's forces breached the walls, poured inside, and carried out a massive massacre of the population. Thousands were killed, some by direct slaughter, others suffocated or trampled in the ensuing chaos. Even the native archbishop perished. By the end of 1144, Edessa had completely fallen into Muslim hands, marking the first time one of the four Crusader principalities was lost. This was an enormous shock to the Western Christian world. Riding this momentum, Zengi continued to capture nearby towns such as Saruj, then proceeded to besiege the fortress of Birajik, a strategic location near the Euphrates River. However, at that critical moment, the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, led by King Baldwin III, arrived to reinforce the area, forcing Zengi to halt his campaign and retreat back to Aleppo to defend Mosul from threats posed by other Muslim rivals. Nonetheless, the western part of the county of Edessa, on the opposite side of the Euphrates, remained under Crusader control, though Edessa was effectively lost. When the news of Edessa's fall reached Europe, it sent shockwaves through the Church and Catholic courts. On December 1st, 1145, Pope Eugenius III issued the papal bull Quantum Praedicatores, officially calling for a second crusade to reclaim Edessa and defend the threatened Crusader states. About 60,000 Crusader warriors from across Europe answered this call, among them two prominent leaders, King Louis VII of France, Emperor Conrad III of the Holy Roman Empire, Germany. Before the expedition from Europe set out, a major event occurred. Zengi was assassinated in 1146 by one of his own slaves, possibly due to internal conflicts or instigated by his rivals. Zengi's power passed to his son Nur ad-Din, who would later become one of the greatest Muslim strategists of the Middle Ages. According to plan, the German army decided to march overland through Hungary, while the French forces under King Louis VII were to depart on June 15th. In May 1147, the First Crusader fleet departed from England, heading to the Holy Land. However, bad weather forced the ships to stop at the Portuguese coast in the city of Porto on June 16, 1147. Subsequently, the Crusaders agreed to assist the King of Portugal in reclaiming cities held by Muslims. Because of this, they were permitted to settle there, and most remained behind, while only a small group continued on to the Holy Land. Meanwhile, the German Crusaders began advancing into Anatolia with the intention to join the French forces at Constantinople. The King of Hungary allowed them safe passage through his territory. However, when the German army reached Nicaea, a minor conflict broke out near Philippopolis between some unruly soldiers and local inhabitants. Despite this, by September 10, they arrived at Constantinople, where a skirmish with Byzantine forces made the Germans realize they needed to move quickly into Anatolia. Emperor Conrad III decided to split his forces into two groups. He led an elite cavalry force marching overland, while the other group traveled along the coast under the command of Otto of Freising. On November 25th, Conrad and his army fought Muslim forces at the Battle of Dorylaeum. The Turks used a feigned retreat tactic, then counterattacked the German cavalry, which had become separated from the main force. The Germans fell into the trap, were defeated, and retreated to Nicaea. From that point on, the German Crusaders were continually harassed by the Turks. Emperor Conrad himself was wounded in combat. The coastal force led by Bishop Otto marched south toward the Mediterranean coast, but also suffered a severe defeat. By early 1148, most of Otto's troops had been killed, captured, or sold into slavery. Meanwhile, the French Crusaders departed Metz in June 1147, led by King Louis VII, along with many nobles. They marched through Hungary and encountered fewer obstacles than the Germans. However, when the King of Hungary discovered that the French army had accepted a former usurper of the Hungarian throne into their ranks, he expressed displeasure. Nevertheless, he still agreed to assist the French forces. Emperor Manuel I of Byzantium, in order to secure his empire, halted his military campaign against the Normans and signed a peace treaty to focus on confronting the Crusaders. However, his relations with the French remained better than with the Germans, as the French did not cause major conflicts. After the French crossed the Bosphorus into Anatolia, they discovered the German forces had suffered heavy losses. The remaining German troops joined with the French under Louis VII. They followed Bishop Otto's route to the Mediterranean coast, arriving at Italia in December 1147. At this time, King Conrad fell ill and returned to Constantinople. Louis VII, ignoring warnings about Turkish ambushes, continued marching from Italia with the French forces and the remnants of the German army. The Turks lying in wait attacked during the battle at Mount Cadmus on December 24, 1147. However, the French won the battle. They then repelled another ambush near Laodicea. In early January 1148, the Crusaders arrived at the city of Adoya, where King Louis VII's French forces continued their march along the coast. However, the Crusader forces gradually became fragmented and lost connection with the main army. In the battle at the Taurus Mountains, the French suffered heavy losses due to the difficult terrain and lack of supplies. On January 6, 1148, after overcoming many hardships from Constantinople to Anatolia, the French Crusader army under King Louis VII entered the lands of the eastern Mediterranean. However, as they advanced toward the Italia, they were repeatedly harassed by the Seljuk Turks who burned villages and devastated farmlands, making it impossible for the Crusaders to secure food supplies. Initially, the Crusader forces planned to gather their fleet in Italy and sailed to the Holy Land via Egypt, but all plans were thwarted by the weather. A major storm shattered most of the fleet, forcing the French army to retreat in disarray. Almost the entire French army was destroyed or scattered by this natural disaster, combined with ambushes by Muslim forces. This event is regarded as the marker of the near-total failure of the Crusaders in the early stage. Despite heavy losses, the French finally reached Antioch on March 19th. There they hoped to receive support from Prince Raymond of Poitiers to continue the campaign against Aleppo, a strategic city controlled by Muslims. However, Louis VII declined this proposal because he only wished to complete his pilgrimage to Jerusalem quickly rather than be drawn into risky military plans. Meanwhile, King Conrad III of Germany, along with the German Crusader forces, arrived in Jerusalem in early April. Louis arrived a few days later. Both kings and the European knights were warmly welcomed by the lords and nobility of Jerusalem. After the council meeting in Jerusalem on June 24, 1148, an important decision was made. Instead of attacking Aleppo as originally planned, the target would shift to Damascus. This city had once been an ally of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but had recently leaned toward Islam. This move aimed to prevent Aleppo from receiving reinforcements from Damascus should the northern campaign proceed. By July 23, 1148, the Crusader forces numbering around 50,000 began their campaign to attack Damascus from the west. The armies from Jerusalem, Germany, and France gathered one after another to assault the city, hoping to capture a crucial stronghold in the region. However, the Muslim defenders in Damascus were well prepared. They continuously harassed the Crusaders, disrupted supply lines, and mounted fierce defenses. Although the Crusaders reached the city walls and built siege works from the surrounding orchards, they faced strong resistance and could not break through. On July 27th, facing fierce resistance and internal divisions, especially disagreements among the French, German, and Jerusalem commanders, the Crusaders were forced to relocate their camp to the east side of Damascus. However, this area lacked sufficient supplies and was more vulnerable to attack. The internal discord deepened, with many local commanders refusing to continue fighting. Under mounting pressure, the three main leaders of the campaign, Louis VII and Conrad III, and the Jerusalem Lord Baldwin III, had no choice but to abandon the siege of Damascus, marking the greatest defeat of the Second Crusade. On July 28th, the armies began to withdraw from Damascus. Yet the retreat was far from easy. Turkish and Muslim forces pursued them relentlessly, causing further heavy losses to the Crusaders. The disastrous failure at Damascus dealt a fatal blow to the prestige and morale of the crusading movement. The European armies withdrew in disappointment and deep division. Subsequently, a new plan to attack Ascalon was proposed, but was quickly abandoned since only the forces of Jerusalem were willing to fight. The European kings returned home. A papal representative bitterly declared, "This defeat is a national disgrace. The only victory the Crusaders have achieved is a small triumph at Lisbon, where the Christian forces wrested control from the Moors, paving the way for the Reconquista of Iberia. Following this defeat, the position of the Kingdom of Jerusalem weakened significantly. Faith in crusading campaigns among Europeans sharply declined. The Muslims, especially the Syrian and Egyptian forces, began to regain the initiative. The rise of Nur ad-Din and later Saladin would soon threaten the very existence of Jerusalem. In 1150, the city of Edessa, the initial target of the Second Crusade, fell permanently to Muslim control. By 1153, Muslim forces captured the city of Ascalon, ending hopes of restoring Christian power in southern Palestine. The Second Crusade ended as a military and spiritual disaster for Western Christendom, setting the stage for more intense conflicts ahead, particularly Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem in 1187, which sparked the Third Crusade.
If you like this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Did You Know channel to discover more interesting mysteries. See you in the next video.